Hello and welcome to another opening explorations video. This is an introduction to the Queen's Gambit, which is the position you see here on the board. And from this point, there are different options. How do you arrive at the Queen's Gambit? Well, the game begins with d4 by white and d5 by black, taking an equal share of the center. And now c4. This is the Queen's Gambit. Now, this is called a gambit because you're gambiting this pawn. Black can accept the gambit by taking the pawn or decline and choose not to capture this pawn right away or not at all. So from here, like I said, there are different options. The number one played move is this, c6, but this would transpose into the Slav defense. And so instead of that, we'll look at the number two move, the Queen's Gambit declined. So once you have this Queen's Gambit declined move, what does this do? Well, now, if white decides to capture, this e-pawn can recapture, keeping an equal share in the center. Although, after this exchange, white will have two strong central pawns versus only one by black, but they will each have a half open file to operate on. All right, now the normal move, the most played move is knight to c3. So first I'll take a look at the most played moves. Knight to c3. Now this just adds more pressure to this d5 pawn. So now we have 1-2 attackers and 1-2 defenders, the queen and the pawn here. So black just continues with knight to f6, the most commonly played move, just adding more defense to the d pawn here. And now most often played is to capture here. So we'll take a look at that. Capture, recapture. And so now, why did black not recapture with the knight? Well, that could lead to e4 chasing that knight. And then the knight could capture here, pulling the c-pawn in to fortify this d-pawn, and white would be left with a nice, pretty strong pawn center. But normally we have e takes d5, played most often by far. And the game would continue with bishop to g5 being played 19,000 times in this database. And it looks like that move gives white the best chance for advantage, pinning the knight here. And now we have bishop to e7, breaking the pin. e3 is played, unleashing the light squared bishop. So now most often played is c6. So this prevents any possible checks here, prevents the knight from being able to capture this pawn. It just fortifies this right here. So bishop to d3 is played next by white. The knight develops, and we see in this position both sides are just trying to get all their pieces out. So queen to c2, castle, knight at g to e2, and now white is ready to castle. The rook goes to the half open file, and white can castle kingside or queenside. Most often is kingside, because opposite side castling can lead to wilder positions. And usually if you're playing the Queen's Gambit as white, that's usually a more solid opening with less crazy tactics. And so it's probably more likely that white will castle on the king side to make it more of a strategic game and less opposite side castling crazy tactics. All right, so here we have knight to f8 being played next to help fortify this pawn. And now f3, which keeps this knight from moving forward, but also maybe fortifies a possible pawn push here to e4. Bishop to e6, helping to fortify this pawn. And now rook at a to d1, rook to c8, king over to h1 to get off this diagonal in case there are exchanges at some point. And the bishop could fire down here and line up on the king. So now we have a6, keeping this knight out in case this pawn wants to move forward. a3, preventing this or limiting the scope of this bishop. And then what do we have next? Knight retreats back, unleashing an attack on the bishop. So then we have an exchange, which helps develop this queen. And knight to f4 attacks the bishop. h6. That way this pawn is not under attack by the battery. Queen over to f2. Perhaps getting ready to move over here at some point to the king side and try and attack the king here. And then the game just played out further with knight to b6, e4, but you get the picture here. This is one way the Queen's Gambit could go. Let's see if we go back here, back to the beginning. So the initial Queen's Gambit setup, and this was a Queen's Gambit declined. From here we played knight to c3. If knight to f3 were played, let's see if that's much different. Knight to f6, and it kind of transposes back. Knight to c3. It looks like g3 could be an attempt. Fianchettoing the bishop here, maybe lining up and putting another, aiming another attacker at this d pawn. Bishop to e7, just in case there's a pin here. Castle, e3. Now this pawn is protected. h6, putting the question to the bishop. Retreating and keeping the bishop pair. And now b6, getting ready to fianchetto, or even move the bishop here and target this. So capture, knight captures, capture, capture, knight cap. So a series of exchanges here. And now we have the rook taking the half open file. Bishop develops. Queen preventing the knight from developing. And now c5, attacking the center. So queen to a3, pinning the pawn to the queen. But now we have rook to c8, a counter pin. Oh, I shouldn't say a counter pin, but adding more pressure to this. That way if there's an exchange here, we have a capture with check. So bishop to e2, a5 gaining space, castling, queen to a7, and then finally an exchange here. Rook up to c3, perhaps getting ready to double rooks. The knight finally develops here. The rooks double, and rook at c to b8, grabbing the half open file. Knight to e1, a4 gaining more space, knight up to d3, adding more pressure here. c4 avoids the attack on that pawn, and knight to f4, attacking the bishop. So that's ignored for knight to f6, bishop to f3, keeping the knight out of e4 and kind of lining up on this rook as well. Queen over to b6, allowing this rook to move. And then that's as far as this game went here. All right, since this is an introduction, I guess I better get back here to the beginning. Let's reset and start from the beginning. So d4, d5, c4, the Queen's Gambit. Now, we looked at the Queen's Gambit declined. You can also have the Queen's Gambit accepted with this move. And now it looks like knight to f3 is played most often. You could, I guess, immediately go ahead for e4. But, you know, if you wanted a more solid position, you might want to play e3 and just fortify this pawn. So knight to f6 is played most often. And then e3, a more solid choice, defending the pawn, unleashing the bishop's attack on the c pawn. And most often played here is e6. So bishop captures, c5, targeting the center pawn. White ignores that. a6 is played, preparing to push forward here and attack the bishop. So now we have capture, queens are exchanged, and the pawn is recaptured. So knight at b to d2 with the threat of, well, one, it keeps the knight from jumping forward. It could swing the knight over here and attack the bishop. Black usually just castles. And then we have a retreat. Rook to d8. And now we see why this retreat might be good, because now the knight can move and the rook will be protected. So normally we have knight moving forward here, and the rook does not, or excuse me, the knight does not want to capture this knight, or we have, oh, wait a minute. Is that a mistake here? Let me go back here, because it looks like you could just capture with a check and then pick off the knight. So that looks like something you do not want to play. Huh. Yeah, that looks like just a mistake there. You know, if you go knight to e5, they can just capture with check. Then if you recapture, black would just pick off your knight. All right, so yeah, that's not looking so good. Well, there you go. One thing to avoid in the main line. Let's see here. Maybe we need a closer look at that. So, oh, I just moved the wrong piece. Knight to e5, excuse me. Knight to e5 is the most common move. And then bishop to e7, just retreating back here. Knight at e to c4. So maybe you threaten to jump up in here and fork these two pieces. Knight at b to d7. Knight to b3 forking. And yeah, here it looks like looks like you know, there's only a few games here as examples, but you know, if you go here, why would you go here? The knight could just capture. So once again, another move that doesn't look so great. But we're down into like so few example games that, and this is an introduction, so you have to take a look at this deeper in your own analysis if you would like. Let me go back here. So Queen's Gambit accepted, which was these moves here, d4, d5, c4, and then the Queen's Gambit accepted is to capture here. So we looked at knight to f3, but also e4 could be played, grabbing the center. And that's one reason you might want to play the Queen's Gambit. You give up the c pawn, allowing you to place both pawns in the center. But most often played here is e5, it looks like. Or knight to f6 could be played, but that may invite the e5 pawn move chasing the knight. So e5 is played more often. And instead of capturing and giving up your queens here, knight to f3 is played most often. Then capture, bishop captures, knight protects here, castle, bishop to e6, and then here you just take, and what next? Queen to b3, forking these two pawns. So queen to d7, capture, we attack the queen, queen retreats, and knight develops here. So, I don't know, this just gives you an idea of how the game could go in another Queen's Gambit accepted. You know, what do we have after this? Knight develops, bishop develops, and black is ready to castle. b3 to prevent a future attack on the b pawn and to help develop this bishop. Castling, bishop to b2, adding pressure here. So e5 fortifies, and rook at f to c1, grabbing the half open file. Now we have an attack on the queen, queen to e2, king over to h8, and what? Knight to e1. But you get the idea. White will try and operate, maybe down this half open c file. Perhaps later target these, this isolated pawn. Now we could go a little bit further. Let's see. Knight to c4. That move doesn't look so bad. The rook retreats. We could just capture the bishop, or ignore that and just play knight to e1 here. Get ready to blockade this pawn. F to e8, f3, fortify this pawn, h6, giving the king some breathing room, knight to d3, blockading the pawn, and preventing this knight from jumping in here. But the knight does it anyway. And so now, what? Knight to f2. Knight to f2. Queen to b5, lining up on our queen. a3 attacks the knight. Knight retreat. And b4 now. Bishop back up to f8. Knight where to d3, adding pressure on this. So queen to b7, rook to c2. Anyway, I'm not going to go too much deeper into that. Let's take one more look at everything. And let me know in comments if you don't want me to go that deep into the positions, on an introduction. Maybe I shouldn't have dived that far into the position, but d4, d5, c4, the Queen's Gambit. We could take a quick look at what other possibilities there are. e6 is a Queen Gambit declined. Accepted would be if they capture here. Another option appears to be this. And now there's a threat of capturing and going after this right here. So, develop is played most often. Then capture. Now this is targeted, so you would protect. Knight develops. e4. Bishop pins. We have e3 helping guard this, or bishop to e3. Then e6 getting ready to develop the other bishop. So we capture. Bishop pins this knight. Queen to c2 helping protect that. Now what? Castling. Rook to d1. Queen to e7. Bishop back to e2. And e5. So d5 grabs some space. Knight jumps down to d4. Interesting move. Then we have a series of exchanges here. All right, so what do we have in this position? Looks like 7 pawns versus 6, and the rest of the material is even. So white just comes out a pawn ahead here. You have knight to g4, king down to e2, queen to g5. King to d1, f5, takes, rook takes. We attack the queen and protect this pawn. Queen to f4, attack, knight attacks, and then we exchange. Rook to e1, grabbing the open file. Queen to d6, blockading the isolated pawn. And now g3. I'll play this out a little bit further. So they just pile up on the isolated pawn. f4, start pushing your pawn majority on the king side. And rook to f7. Rook to e6. Oh, that was e5, sorry. Rook to e6, we attack the queen. So the queen just moves back here. And then, what? Rook to e5, we protect. Queen moves over. Maybe a threat of a check here. Queen to e4. Queen checks. And then queen to e1, blocking and protecting the pawn. So we have an exchange. King captures. Rook at f to d7, piling up on this pawn. So just let this pawn fall. So after that's captured, capture, capture, and recapture. So the game ended in a draw, but there is a pawn majority here. And, the king is on this side to help fight and stop the white's pawn majority from pushing forward. This is under attack. So, what is played here? I guess a counter attack on this pawn. So capture, capture, king up to e2, a5 is played, king up to f3, a4, pawn majority is pushed, a3, capture, capture with check, king moves up, check again, and now these pawns are under attack, so just a retreat, rook to c3. I'll just play this out. It is kind of instructive. Rook to f3, get behind the unopposed pawn here in the pawn majority. Rook to b8 check, king to f7, rook to h8, targeting this and forcing it forward. So now the rook moves back out as far away from the king as possible. We have g5, capture en passant, king captures, rook to a6 check, king moves up, rook to a1, perhaps preparing to get behind the passed pawns, but the king moves up. Now we push and an exchange here. So h5, f4 or h4 here, but it's going to end up being a draw. So capture, capture, and so this is just a drawn position. And if you're not familiar with these, I have some videos on this. You just block. He's got to go here. You just step straight back, and let's say if the king tries to move forward, you just stay in front, and you just kind of block the pawn. So step straight back, and if the king goes over, you step in front, and then it just leads to a draw like this. All right, well, that was just a little introduction to the Queen's Gambit. Feel free to leave any comments, like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.